I was chatting with some of you folks earlier, and it was kind of nerve-wracking to realize that many of you here are experts on the topic which I'm speaking. And people were out there handing me things. Did you read this? Did you know that? And so forth. It makes me very nervous. I don't even know why you came here tonight. Unless it's to see if I know anything about it. So anyway, since we did get started late, I'll dispense with the usual nonsensical jokes and sort of jump into the topic and splash around until our time runs out and see how far we can get. And to give it some kind of historical perspective, I'd like to go back in time. In fact, we'll go back to the 1st century BC, to a tiny kingdom called Phrygia. There was a philosopher in Phrygia by the name of Epictetus. And it was Epictetus who said, appearances are of 4 kinds. Things either are as they appear to be, or they neither are nor appear to be, or they are but do not appear to be, or they are not and yet appear to be. Everybody got that? Well, when I read that, I thought for sure that if Epictetus were alive today, he probably would be a Harvard professor of banking and money and would have written the definitive textbook on the Federal Reserve. Because what Epictetus did is what is so commonly done by experts in the field of economics and banking. They take a relatively simple topic, and by the time they're through with it, you'd haven't the foggiest idea what they said. And all Epictetus, yes, amen. All Epictetus was saying was that appearances can sometimes be deceiving. That's all. And then he broke it down into different ways in which they can be deceiving. And I thought that would be a good way to start my topic tonight, because if there's anything that's an appearance that's deceiving, it's the Federal Reserve System. And in fact, that's the theme from my presentation. In particular, appearances of the 4th kind, which are those which are not and yet appear to be. When I went through the research on this topic for the first time, the way I normally do this, in case you're interested, which you're probably not, but it's interesting to me, is I never try and determine in advance what it is I'm going to say or what material I'm going to include, because I don't know enough about it yet. I just plow into it, see how far I get, and I usually wind up with a stack of photocopies, pages out of books and reports and scribbled notes on interviews and that kind of thing. It's just a huge, huge stack. It's a jumble. When I'm all done, then I go through the stack. It takes me a long time, like a couple of weeks, just to go back and read these pieces of paper and see what they are, and I start putting them into smaller stacks, see if I can't find categories. And when I'm all done, usually I wind up with 8, 10, 12 stacks or something like that, and usually those are the chapters of a book that I'm going to do. That's the outline. It just sort of takes form. Well, when I did that with this project, I wound up with 7 stacks. And those 7 stacks turned out to be 7 reasons, in my opinion, to abolish the Federal Reserve System. And here they are. The Fed is incapable of accomplishing its stated objectives. 2, it is a cartel operating against the public interest. 3, it is the supreme instrument of usury. 4, it generates our most unfair tax. 5, it encourages war. 6, it destabilizes the economy. And 7, it is an instrument of totalitarianism. Now, I phrased those in their most extreme form because I wanted them to sound kind of shocking, but they are accurate. At least as I see it, they are accurate. And I think regardless of what you may think about those points right now, I think you all would have to agree that if any one of them could be proven, it probably would be reason enough to abolish the Federal Reserve System. As time permits, I'd like to just splash around, as I say, in the first 3 of these reasons to abolish the Fed. And the way to do that, I think, is to start with where the story began, which is on Jekyll Island. Most of you already know by now that Jekyll Island, and the title for this book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is not a sequel to Jurassic Park. Jekyll Island is a very real island off the coast of Georgia. And back in 1910, which is where this story begins, that island was owned by a small group of millionaires from New York. The families such as J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and people like that. This was where their families went to spend the winter months. And they had a very elaborate clubhouse there, which is still there, by the way. You can go and visit that. It's been restored by the state of Georgia. And there are quite a few of the cottages still there that have been restored. The cottages is where the families went, you know, these little places. I think the one I went into, they said they had 14 bathrooms in it. Just little places for the summer. They're still there. And this is where the Federal Reserve System had its conception. And here's the story. It was 3 years before the Federal Reserve Act was written. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, so this story begins in 1910. It was November of that year when Senator Nelson Aldrich sent his private railroad car to the New Jersey Railroad Station. There, it waited for himself and... That's the train, getting ready to leave. It waited for himself and 6 others to arrive in great secrecy. These men were told to come one at a time, not to be seen with each other, not to talk with each other on the way to the train depot. They were told to avoid newspaper reporters. Any one of them would have been very well recognized, and so they were to avoid reporters. And one of them actually carried a shotgun in a shotgun case, so that if he had been stopped and asked where he was going, he could say he was going on a hunting trip to shoot ducks. And the interesting thing about that is that the man had never fired a gun in his life. It was just part of the general deception. Now, you may wonder, by the way, if what I'm telling you is actually true or whether I'm exaggerating, and you will find out shortly from the words of the men who actually went to this meeting and participated in it, that I am not exaggerating. I'm giving you a very accurate description of what happened. When these men arrived at the station and climbed on board the private car, the privacy and the secrecy continued. They were told to avoid using last names, to use first names only. And several of them even abandoned their first names altogether and used code names. And the purpose for that was so that the crew, the train crew, the servants, would not recognize who these men were, because they were afraid that by that path the word might get out to the outside world. And secrecy was so important. Disclosure and discovery simply must not happen. Well, the train pulled out late at night. It traveled all that night, all the next day, all the next night, on a 1,000-mile journey southward to Brunswick, Georgia. The following morning, the 7 men took a ferry across the inland straits to Jekyll Island, and they went to the clubhouse. And for 9 more days, they sat around a table and they hammered out all the important details of the Federal Reserve System. When they were done, back on the railroad car, another 2 nights and a day, back to New Jersey, back to New York, back to Wall Street. And for several years, actually quite a few years after that, these men denied that such a meeting ever took place. It was only many years later, after the Federal Reserve System was firmly established, that they began to talk openly about their part in it. Now, who were these 7 men? I've mentioned one already, Senator Nelson Aldrich. Now, he was chairman of the National Monetary Commission. That was the group in Congress that was given the responsibility to develop reform legislation in the field of banking. He was the chairman of that committee. There was a great deal of alarm in those days among the American people over the concentration of power into the hands of a few large banking firms in New York. This is what they called in those days the money trust. And so Congress was looking into ways to write some legislation to break the grip of the money trust over banking and over the financial markets of this country. And Senator Aldrich was chairman of the committee that was given that responsibility. He was also a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., which means, of course, that eventually he became the grandfather of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, who was our vice president. That's where the word Aldrich comes from. That was his grandfather. Another man there at that meeting was Abraham Piet Andrew. He was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Also present was Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank of New York, which was the most powerful of all the banks at that time, and he represented the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Also present was Henry Davison, who was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was there. He was the president of the First National Bank of New York, another one of the giants. Benjamin Strong was present. He was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company, and he later became the first head of the Federal Reserve System. And finally, but certainly not least of all, was Paul Warburg, who was born in Germany, later became a naturalized American citizen. He was a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France, and his brother was Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Paul Warburg was one of the wealthiest men in the world at that time. And for those of you who are Little Orphan Annie fans, you may remember the character in that comic strip called Daddy Warbucks. Well, Daddy Warbucks was the characterization of Paul Warburg. Everybody at the time knew that. As a matter of fact, if you look in the photograph section of my book, you'll see a photograph of Paul Warburg, and you can see the similarity to Daddy Warbucks. Okay, those were the 7 men who were at Jekyll Island and literally created the Federal Reserve System. Together, they represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. 7 men. Now, did it really happen that way? Frank Vanderlip, who, as I mentioned before, was one of the participants. In 1935, on February 9, he wrote an article that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post. And I'd like to read for you just an excerpt from that article. Vanderlip said, "I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the railroad terminal on the New Jersey littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness, attached to the rear end of a train to the south. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. We addressed one another as Ben, Paul, Nelson, and Abe. Davison and I adopted even deeper disguises, abandoning our first name. On the theory that we were always right, he became Wilbur and I became Orville, after those 2 aviation pioneers, the Wright brothers. The servants and train crew may have known the identities of 1 or 2 of us, but they did not know all. And it was the names of all printed together that would have made our mysterious journey significant in Washington, in Wall Street, even in London. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen." Well, why not? What's the big deal about a bunch of bankers, a group of bankers, even important, wealthy bankers, getting together and talking about banking? Vanderlip answers that question himself in the same article. He says, "If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress." Why not? Remember, the purpose of the bill was to break the grip of the money trust over the financial markets of the United States, and it was written by the money trust. I mean, there's the scam right out in the open from the very get-go of the Federal Reserve System. It was offered to the American people as banking reform, and it was written by the very people who wanted to make sure that there was no reform, that there was, in fact, further concentration into their hands and further solidification of power. So obviously they had to be secret about it. There's something else about that group, though, if you think about it. Look at that list and recall that there we had the representatives of the Rockefeller interests, J.P. Morgan, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs. Something seems strange about that. Ladies and gentlemen, these were competitors. These were the giants that strode across the financial stage, often, or prior to this time, beating against each other, blood on the battlefield, trying to capture major segments of the financial markets. Here they were coming together and doing something that they all agreed upon. What do you suppose that was? The word is cartel. The Federal Reserve Act was the embodiment of a cartel agreement. A cartel is defined as a grouping of independent businesses who come together for the purpose of reducing or eliminating competition between themselves for the purpose of enhancing their profits. By fixing prices or dividing up markets or products and services, they agree not to compete. They can charge more for those products and services. The other side of that coin, of course, is that the public winds up paying more for those same products and services. These giant investment dynasties for about the 15-year period prior to that were more and more coming together on joint ventures. They had beaten out all the small competition, and just the giants remained in the arena. And it became obvious to them that they weren't going to destroy any one of them. So they had started to come together, and this was the age of newly emerging cartels. And they decided to work in joint ventures, and this was very profitable to them. So by the time 1910 came along, they knew exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to form a banking cartel and to divide up the power between themselves to eliminate or at least seriously reduce competition. And yet there's still something more interesting about that group. Not only was it a scam in that here was the money trust writing their own bill to break the grip of the money trust. Not only did they form a cartel, but if you look at it, you see that this cartel went into partnership with the government of the United States. There was a partnership formed here. Now that's an interesting thing about cartels. If you look in their history, they tend to come together and then they tend to fly apart. They come together to reduce competition, and then that works for a while until finally one of the members feels very strong and feels like he doesn't have a big enough piece of the pie. He breaks out of the cartel, starts to compete again. There's blood on the battlefield. Prices go down for the product or services. The public benefits during this competitive phase, but then when it's all over, they come back and form a new cartel with a different division or balance of power between the members. It's sort of what we've seen in the airline industry in more recent times. And so one of the things that cartels worry most about is the fact that they tend to fly apart. The only way you can really prevent that is to go into partnership with government and have government enforce your cartel agreement for you. Now it's a matter of law. And this is exactly what they did. They went into partnership with the government. Well, now, in any partnership, there has to be a benefit to both partners. Let's take a look at the benefit that this cartel and this partnership has derived for not only the bankers, but government itself. And to really understand that benefit, I'd like to describe for you how the Federal Reserve System creates money. This is what I call the Mandrake mechanism. For those of you who are old enough to remember, back in the 40s, there was a cartoon character by the name of Mandrake the Magician. And he had the ability to materialize things out of nothing, and when he wanted to, he could wave his cape and then they went back into nothing. They disappeared. And when I was learning how the Federal Reserve System created money, I thought, this is the Mandrake mechanism if there ever was one. I'd like to warn you, before I start on this, that if you want to put your mind at rest right now, don't try to make sense out of this, because it does not make sense. If you're trying, like I did at first, I don't understand this, how do they do that? You'll just blow a fuse. Because remember, this is a scam. Once you hold that firmly in your mind, it's easier to understand. In any event, here's basically how it works. It starts with Congress. It starts with the government side of this partnership. Congress needs money, which is nothing new in our recent times. They need lots of it, and they're not getting nearly enough money from taxes, direct taxes, to cover their bill. So let's just start with the need for a mere $1 billion. Congress goes to the Treasury and asks for the $1 billion. Treasury says, you got to be kidding, guys, we don't have any money here. You fellas spent it all by February 15, all of the tax dollars were gone. Congress says, not to worry. They walk down the street to the printing office. And they stop in and pick up some of these freshly printed pieces of paper, certificates, with nice fancy borders around the edge, and eagle across the top, and an impressive seal at the bottom, and it says United States Treasury note, or bond, or some such. And you hold up the light, it says IOU. That's what it really means. So they take this IOU, they go down the street a little bit further to the Federal Reserve Bank, and they offer these IOUs into the open market for the public or some institution or some other country or bank, somebody to step forward and exchange money, give the money to Congress in return for the IOU. So this is nothing mysterious about this so far. But often they don't get enough, especially at the interest rates they have set. They always keep the interest rates just a little bit on the low side so that the public doesn't come forth with quite enough of this. Congress says, still not to worry, because whatever the public doesn't buy, they go further down the street now to the Federal Reserve System, and the Fed has been waiting for them because that's the reason it was created. They walk in there, and the Federal Reserve officer whips out the check from the bottom drawer of the desk, and he writes a check to the Treasury of the United States government for, let's say, $1 billion in this case, and hands it to the Secretary of the Treasury. Now wait a minute, let's just stop right there. That checkbook. What is behind that checkbook? What account is there? What money is there? Where did that money come from? And the answer is, there is no account. There was no money behind that checkbook. It's just a plain piece of paper, just like the bond is a piece of paper. There is absolutely no money at the Federal Reserve System behind that check. Now, if you and I were to do that, we would go to jail. But they can do it because Congress wants them to do it. That is how Congress gets its easy money. You may have noticed for many, many years, Congress hasn't even concerned itself over what anything costs. Why should they? If it's not covered by taxes, they can go down to the Fed and get it. Like that. The Fed has to provide it for them. See, that's part of the agreement that's written into the Federal Reserve Act. So Congress gets easy money anytime it wants, in any amount that it wants. Now we see how the government is benefiting, in a sense, from this partnership. Now let's follow it. You think this is bizarre so far? Just wait till we get it further down the line here. Let's follow that money. The $1 billion now, that check that they just wrote from the Federal Reserve System, goes into the government's checking account. It's deposited there. And all of a sudden, ching, 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 all the numbers show up in their ledger books and in their computers, and they now have $1 billion in their checking account. And they can start writing checks against that, and they do. So they send a couple $100 million to some foreign dictator. You know, they'll bail out the International Monetary Fund, or pay the bill for the United Nations, or invade some country, or whatever they have to do in the public interest of the American people. But to simplify this, let's assume that they're just going to pay some of their federal employees. To make it real simple, let's take the post office worker, the guy that delivers your mail. So he gets a paycheck now. And for the purpose of this example, we'll make it real simple and say he gets a $100 check. Now, he's very happy because he's got a check for $100. He doesn't know, he never dreams that that money didn't exist 2 days ago. And he doesn't care. He's got it. He can spend it. So he takes it and deposits it into his checking account. Now, hang on to your seats. Here's where the action is. Now that it's deposited into his checking account in the local commercial bank down the street, The banker has $100 that he didn't have before, and he can hardly wait. He runs over and opens up the loan window and says, "Gather around, everybody, we have money to loan." Now, how much money does he have to loan? $100? No, he has $900 to loan. Now, doesn't that make sense? Now, it doesn't happen quite this simply. It's got to go out and back, and goes out and back several times, actually about 28 times before the full effect. But basically, he has $100 that somebody deposited, and he can now loan $900 because the Federal Reserve says that the commercial banks need hold and reserve only 10%. So they call that $100 a reserve, which means they have $900 to loan. So they get their checkbook out now, and they start writing checks or applying credit to somebody's checking account. Now, where did that money come from? What account did that come from? And the answer, again, is exactly the same as it was with the Federal Reserve. There is no money there. There is no account. They create that $900 out of thin air. So, you see, the real action is not at the Federal Reserve making money for the government out of nothing. The real action is in the commercial banking structure making money for loan out of nothing. Remember, this is a banking cartel. And it was designed to produce profits for the banks. The government just was dragged into it. It's got its 10%, but the bank's got 90%, you see. For every $1 that they create for the government, they create 9 for the private banking industry. Now, that's a pretty good deal. You know, if I could write checks without any money in any account, just write checks, $100,000 checks, $10,000 checks, $20,000 checks, I could write them all day long and loan it to you folks at interest. It'd be a nifty way to go. Who wouldn't want to be a banker? Remember, this is a cartel, and it's a scam. That's the Mandrake mechanism. So let's review. In this partnership between government and banks, between what I call the political scientists and the monetary scientists, and this is a science, the political scientists get instant money in any amount at any time without having to worry about whether taxes will cover it, and the monetary scientists are able to collect interest on nothing. Now, what's wrong with that? Why should we care? We should care because this all represents new money. All this money that comes into existence out of nothing goes into the economy, and it dilutes the value of the dollars that were already out there. And the more that's pushed out, the more diluted it gets. It's just like pouring a gallon of water into the bowl of soup. The soup gets thinner and thinner and thinner, till finally you can't find any vegetables in it at all. So prices appear to be going up, but that's not really happening. What's really happening is that the value of the dollar is going down. Prices are remaining very stable throughout all of this period. If anything, real prices are probably going down to reflect the improvement in technology and efficiency. But in those fields where technology plays a minor role, such as in handcrafted items and so forth, even there, prices would remain very, very stable over long periods of time if the money were backed by gold or silver, something which cannot be manipulated by the scientists. And to give you an illustration of that, in ancient Rome, a 1-ounce gold coin would buy a toga, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of sandals. Today, a 1-ounce gold coin will buy a fine man's suit, a handcrafted belt, and a pair of shoes. The price, the real price of these items has not changed in thousands of years if you were using real money. But the things that we carry around called Federal Reserve notes, they keep getting more and more valueless because the Federal Reserve System and their partners, the government, keep pumping more and more and more out into the economy. Now let's go back to Jekyll Island. They had a little problem there, and that was in choosing a name for this scam. This partnership between government and the banking fraternity was not new with the Federal Reserve System. It came into being in Europe during the 16th century, and by the time the Bank of England was actually formed in 1694, it was perfected. They called it a central bank. Now that's just the name they give it. If you get a textbook on banking, look it up in the index and it'll say central bank. And you go to those pages and you'll read about this partnership. And from that point forward, all of the governments of Europe had adopted a central bank mechanism, for the obvious reason that from that point forward, governments didn't have to worry about raising taxes anymore. The kings and princes of Europe discovered that when they got taxes up to a certain point, their subjects tended to rebel. Bad move. So, better way to get that same money is through the Mandrake mechanism, and that's why the central banks became popular in Europe. You see, inflation is a tax. It's just as real as a direct tax through income or excise or any other thing. In fact, it's even worse because you don't know you're paying it. In America today, and in Europe still, I don't think there's one person out of 100 that really knows that inflation is a tax. They never thought about it. Where does that purchasing power go? That declining purchase power. Who gets it? It goes to the government. It's a tax. Don't make any mistake about it. It's a hidden tax called inflation. So, the governments of Europe found out that the hidden tax of inflation was a lot easier and safer to levy against their subjects than direct taxes. Okay, now these men on Jekyll Island had a problem because they knew for certain that they had to set up a central bank here in the United States. But Congress was already on record as saying they did not want a central bank. Congress said, this is America. We're different. We want something that's unique to our particular system and our economy. And so the men on Jekyll Island said, well, what are we going to call this central bank other than a central bank? And they came up with a brilliant stratagem. First, they called it federal, to make it sound like it had something to do with the government. Next, they added the word reserve, to make it seem like it was a sound banking principle of some kind with reserves somewhere. Then they added the word system. That was very important because, as I mentioned before, one of the great concerns was this concentration of power into New York. And so they were going through great motions at the time of talking about dividing up the system into 10 or 12, later became 12 regional branches, and they were going to build these buildings all over the country, even as far out as California, so that people out there could see a Federal Reserve building and think, it's no longer concentrated in New York, as though the building made any difference. So the word system was important. And they created all these Federal Reserve branch banks in the system. And as your host has already mentioned in the preliminary part of this program, what they created was not federal, there are no reserves, it's not a system, and it's not even a bank. It's deception all the way from top to bottom. It's an appearance of the fourth kind. But it worked. The next step was how to sell this deception to the public. When the first draft of the Federal Reserve Act came out, it was called the Aldrich Bill, for obvious reasons, because Senator Aldrich was in charge of the National Monetary Commission. This, by the way, was contrary to the sound advice of Paul Warburg, who said, don't do that. He said, your name, Aldrich, is so closely associated with big business interests that people will vote it down. They won't like it. They'll say it's the bill of the bankers, which in fact it was. But Aldrich apparently had such an ego that he refused to accept that advice. He said, well, this is my bill, I'm respected, and I think he just wanted to go down in history with his name attached to this momentous bill. So, it came out as the Aldrich Bill, and Warburg was right. Bingo. Everybody voted it down. It was the bill of the bankers, big business. Well, that was just a temporary setback. They scrambled up the paragraphs a little bit, rewrote the bill, and found a couple of Democrats to sponsor it. That was not hard to do. I mean, now, if the Republicans were representatives of the big business interests, we all knew that the Democrats represented the common working guy, you know, still true today, like Ted Kennedy. And so they found a couple of millionaire Democrats by the name of Carter Glass and Robert Owen, Owen in the Senate, Glass in the Congress, to sponsor the bill, called the Carter-Glass bill. Now, this was different. It's the same bill, you understand. But now that it was sponsored by the Democrats, and they even got William Jennings Bryan to endorse it, because I don't think he was too bright, but he actually was convinced that this would break the grip of the money trust. Now it was more popular. At the same time, Aldrich and Vanderlip in particular, and other well-known bankers, were going around the country giving speeches condemning the bill that they had written. This was highly effective. People read about that in their newspapers, and the average guy said, "Oh, look at this, the big bankers don't like it? Ah, must be pretty good." These fellows didn't get to be where they were by being stupid. Deception was perfected. Meanwhile, Aldrich, Vanderlip, and the others at the same time were financing support for the bill. They spent a lot of money in generating political support. They were lobbying for it. They set up little committees, education, study groups all over the country. They completely paid for these. The dissemination of literature promoting support, grassroots support for the bill. They donated large amounts of money to some universities and established departments of economics and appointed their own professors to chair these departments, and then those professors went around the country giving speeches telling the people how sound economically this bill was. Also, it was a flexible document. Here again, the genius of Paul Warburg came into play. He knew that in order to get the support of people like William Jennings Bryan, he had to put some provisions into this new bill which actually were pretty good. They limited the power of the Federal Reserve System. And his friend said, "Paul, what are you doing? We don't want that provision." And he said, "Hey, don't you get it? Who cares? Now, it's just a temporary thing. Our objective is to get the bill passed. We can perfect it later." And he wrote about that. And he was right. They got the bill passed, and they perfected it later. The Federal Reserve Act has been amended over 100 times since it was passed. And every one of those sound provisions that were put in there to get it passed have long gone by the wayside. So with this kind of deception and strategy, the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 22nd, 1913. It was signed the next day by President Wilson, and we had the creature from Jekyll Island. Well, what did we get? Let's stand back for a second and look at it from a different angle. We got a corporation which was chartered by Congress, and it was given an exclusive franchise to create the nation's money. We got a mechanism whereby Congress has been able to raise unlimited taxes through inflation without the public even knowing that it's paying the tax. And we got a mechanism whereby the banks can earn interest on nothing. And incidentally, we also got a mechanism for protecting the member banks from failure at taxpayers' expense. We'll talk about that in a moment. I'd like to turn next to the question of who owns the Federal Reserve System. You hear a lot of talk about that today. First, we must establish that it is not an agency of the federal government. It is not a branch of the federal government. It is not a part of the federal government in any way. As I said a moment ago, it's a corporation, which means it has issued stock certificates. And these certificates are held by the member banks within the system. Now, up until that point, it kind of looks like it's a private ownership arrangement. But that's as far as the concept of private ownership goes. For example, that stock does not carry with it any rights to sell. They cannot sell that stock. Well, if you cannot sell something, you really don't own it in the traditional sense of the word. Furthermore, the stock does not carry voting rights that are proportional to the capital investment. The larger banks put up more money than the smaller banks depending on their total assets. But regardless of how many stock certificates or how much money they have put up, they all have just one vote. Furthermore, that vote isn't worth very much. They can vote for the members of the board of directors of their regional branches, but they cannot vote for the management of the national Federal Reserve System, which is where the real power is. They have no voice in that whatsoever. That is selected by the president. Furthermore, if they do vote for executives in their local branches, the national board can override that. They have the right of veto. So you see, power is really in the hands of the national group, and these local branches are just, I don't know what they're doing out there. They have a lot of prestige and they clear a lot of checks, but they have no voice really in the operation of the Federal Reserve System. So you see, this is not really a privately owned corporation in the traditional sense of the word. So what is it? Well, it's a hybrid. It's part public and part private, and it is exactly what you would expect it to be in view of the fact that it is a partnership between government and the private banking cartel. It's a mixture, isn't it? And so this is a unique structure which very well represents that mixed responsibility and mixed purpose. It is a hybrid organization. I think there's too much emphasis on this concept of, well, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation, because usually what happens is that the people who say that then say, therefore, let's abolish it and turn the function over to the Treasury, which wouldn't change anything. It's not who owns it. It's not who owns the stock or what the details of who appoints who to what. It's what it does. It's a central bank, ladies and gentlemen, which means it creates money out of nothing, and it doesn't make any difference whether it's a quasi-private organization, a hybrid. It doesn't make any difference who holds these stock certificates. In every country in Europe, they don't have that hybrid concept. They're all direct arms of the respective governments in Europe, and they do exactly the same thing over there as our Federal Reserve System does here. So I'm saying that just turning it over to the Treasury is not going to solve anything, because the same people will run it, it will do exactly the same thing, and it will follow the same agenda. Well, what is that agenda? The myth that is perpetuated in our history books is that the purpose of the Federal Reserve System is to stabilize the economy and to put an end to the chaotic banking that existed prior to 1913. That's what I learned in school. That's what they're teaching in school today. One of the more popular textbooks on economics currently used is written by Paul Samuelson. And here's what it says, quote, "The Federal Reserve sprang from the panic of 1907 with its alarming epidemic of bank failures. The country was fed up once and for all with the anarchy of unstable private banking." Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is an appearance of the fourth kind. Let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that that was its true objective. If that's the case, let's mark its report card and see how both business and personal bankruptcies are at an all-time high. Banks and savings and loan associations have been failing at larger numbers than ever before in our history. Interest on the national debt is now consuming half of all of our tax dollars. Heavy industry has been largely replaced by overseas competition. We're facing an international trade deficit for the first time in our history, and it's getting worse. 75% of downtown Los Angeles and many other large metropolitan areas are now owned by foreigners, and over half of our nation is in a official state of economic recession. Now that's the scoreboard of the Federal Reserve System after 80 years of stabilizing our economy. And I don't think it's controversial to say that the Federal Reserve has failed to meet its stated objectives. The only controversial part is why it has failed. And my answer to that is that because those were never its true objectives. It's as simple as that. Its true objectives have always been the objectives of any cartel, which is to enhance the profit structure of the members of the cartel. In 1910, in that period 10 through 13, it was very clear what the cartel members were concerned about. They wrote about it. They gave speeches on it. Here they were. They had four major concerns. One, to stop the erosion of monetary control from the large banks in New York. The very thing that the Federal Reserve Act was supposedly drafted to accomplish is the thing they feared. As the country expanded westward and southward, little banks were springing up along the frontier, and although they were yet still no threat to the major New York banks, every year a little bit more of the total reserves of the nation moved away from Wall Street. And the bankers said, we've got to put a stop to this now while we still can. That was objective number one. Objective number two, to reverse the trend of industrial expansion through what is called private capital formation. Now that merely means that in those days, companies were more and more beginning to expand through money that they had saved themselves instead of going to the bank and borrowing money. Now they don't teach that at Harvard anymore about using your own money to expand. It's all called, creative leveraging or something. But in those days, many businesses were withholding some of their dividends from their stockholders each quarter, putting them into a sinking fund, and then when they had enough money, they would build their factories and launch their research and development projects out of their own savings, private capital formation. This was extremely alarming to the bankers. They had to have a way to entice business back to the banks for the loans. And they knew that the only way to do that was to lower interest rates below the natural market level. What they said they needed a flexible currency. Now, a flexible currency is just a code phrase for meaning they wanted money that they could create out of nothing. You see, if you can create money out of nothing, you don't have to charge an awful lot of interest on it to make a profit. So they wanted a flexible currency so they could reduce the interest rates and entice business back to the banks. Their third objective was to protect the banks from bank runs. And that's a bank run, of course, is when more than a couple of percentage of the depositors want their money back. Now the banks have told them that they can have their money back at any time they wish in accounts which are called demand deposits. That's all of your checking accounts are technically called demand deposits because you have the right to demand them at any time and get them back. That is opposed to time deposits, which would be like a CD. When you put your money into a time deposit, you know that you may have to wait 6 months or a year or whatever it states on your receipt. But in demand deposits, like your checkbook, you've been told or led to believe that you're entitled to that money anytime you wish. Well, it's impossible because except for just a few percentage of all of that money put in, it's lent out to somebody. You put your money in there and you walk out the door and say, no, change my mind, I want it back. By the time you get back in line, they're apt to say, sorry, we don't have your money, we just loaned it to the guy in front of you. But don't worry, we have somebody else's money which we can give you. So they can move money around a little bit up to a certain point. And that point is very, very low. And when the word gets out among the depositors that the bank is having trouble paying off, then everybody gets in line. You know the old saying, you don't want your money unless you can't have it. And if you know it's there, then you don't want it. It's human nature. So that's a run on the bank, and the banks needed a way to protect themselves from that. And the fourth thing was to pass on the inevitable losses within the system, to pass those losses on to the taxpayer in the name of protecting the public. Now the question is, did they achieve these objectives, which I am saying are its true objectives and always have been its true objectives? Well, let's do a report card on this one. Did they keep control of the banking system in New York? And the answer is obviously yes. That's where the power resides today. A few years ago, there was a best-selling book on the market called Secrets of the Temple, written by William Grider. It was published by Simon & Schuster. It was an excellent history book on much of this that I'm talking about. And in there, Grider says this: at the time, the conventional wisdom in Congress was that the government institution would finally harness the money trust, disarm its powers, and establish broad democratic control over money and credit. The results were nearly the opposite. The money reforms enacted in 1913, in fact, helped to preserve the status quo, to stabilize the old order. Money center bankers would not only gain dominance over the new central bank, but would also enjoy new insulation against instability and their own decline. Once the Fed was in operation, the steady diffusion of financial power halted. Wall Street maintained its dominant position and even enhanced it, which is all true, and it's demonstrably true. The interesting thing about Grider's book, however, is not his history, which is excellent, but his conclusions. Having proven that the Fed has always worked against the public interest, furthermore, having shown that it was designed to do that from the very beginning, what is his solution? You might think that maybe we should abolish it. Not Grider. No, that's a little too extreme. Well, how about a major overhaul? Not Grider. No, that's too extreme. Well, what does Grider propose to do? He says, well, you see, folks, this is all so complicated that these men have been trying and learning as they go, and don't worry, we're working on it. His solution is that you put in wiser men. Now, that is the kind of powder puff criticism that it takes to get your book published by Simon & Schuster or one of the other major publishing houses which are firmly in the orbit of the large investment banking firms. You can criticize all you wish, just don't change anything. Was self-capitalization reversed? Well, we all know that. In fact, this is the problem with much of business today. Companies are going out of business because they can no longer service their debt. They're in hock to the bank so deeply for everything that the interest payments have just eaten them alive, and they've gone out of business. And those that are hanging in there today, many of them, are paying more money to the banks as interest on their loans than they're paying to the people who own the companies and put up the capital. Yes, they were very successful in that trend through this thing called flexible currency. Have they been successful in passing on losses to the taxpayer? Well, this is a real interesting story in itself. You know, every time a large corporation winds up in trouble that it can't pay its bank loan anymore, what happens? The corporation and the bank go to Congress and convince Congress that it's in the public interest to protect the people to bail out the bank's loans, to cover the loans, guarantee them, or make actual payments. Why? Well, if they don't do it, look at all these people that will lose their jobs, the hunger and the despair. Why, who knows, banks might collapse, it might be a domino effect, it might create a world crisis, nations would be upset, governments might fall, desperate nations might launch atomic attacks against us. I mean, all of these arguments go on and on and on. It's in the public interest, you understand, to bail out these banks. It's happened over and over again. In case you missed some of the more interesting plays in this game, Penn Central Railroad was bailed out in 1970. Lockheed bailed out the same year. Commonwealth Bank of Detroit in 1972. New York City in 1975. Chrysler in 1978. First Pennsylvania Bank in 1980. Continental Illinois, the largest of the banks so far, in 1982. And the list goes on and on. Now, ladies and gentlemen, all of this money, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, to bail out the bank's inevitable losses, has been created by the Federal Reserve System through the Mandrake mechanism, which means that you paid for it through the process, the hidden tax called inflation. And I'd like to just say, even though time is running short, you haven't seen anything of inflation yet. One of the mind-boggling factors of this whole story is that with all of this money that's been created, our rate of inflation has been relatively low, relatively. It's still devastating. I've shown in my book that an average inflation rate of only 5% every year will wipe out your whole life savings over a lifetime. By the time you've worked for 70 years, it'll all be gone. But it's going to be much worse than that. And the amazing thing is how that happened. Much of the bonds that have been created by the Treasury have been bought by people outside of the country. All this money is out there. These bonds and these debt instruments are out there. Dollars are out there. Bonds are out there. Much of the world operates on the American dollar instead of the currencies of their respective countries. That could come to an end someday. It will come to an end someday. The printing of a new money could trigger it. All of these American dollars out there, when the holders of those dollars realize that they've got 30 days or 90 days or whatever the period is to exchange them for a new money, what do you think they're going to do with them? They're going to come flying back home quick to buy something while they can. And all these chickens will come home to roost and will be buried in chicken feathers. All of these American dollars will come home, and then we'll find out what the inflation rate really was all these years. Well, I didn't mean to get off on that, but I just happened to think of it as we went on. All of this money has been created by the Federal Reserve System, and you and I have paid for it through that hidden tax called inflation. And what about the partners in government? How did they make out? How does their report card look? Well, you may have noticed that in many, many years, Congress doesn't worry about what it's going to cost. They've spent more than they've collected in taxes. They're not concerned about taxes anymore. And as a result of that, our national debt stands at $5 trillion and is climbing radically. How much is $5 trillion? Well, if you had a stack of $100 bills 40 inches high, you'd be a millionaire. If you had a stack of $100 bills that totaled up to $5 trillion, it would rise into space 3,350 miles. That's how much $5 trillion is. So Congress is on the way to the moon without firing a rocket. Actions have consequences. Not even counting all of that money that's overseas and all those bonds that may not be turned over, and the Fed will have to create money to pay off those bonds. Even forgetting that, since 1913, this process has caused a 1,000% inflation of prices in this country, which has destroyed over 90% of the dollar's purchasing power. That's how much the political scientists have extracted from us through this process. And they've done it through the Federal Reserve System. But now let's talk very briefly about usury. Usury in ancient times was defined as interest on a loan, period. Any interest on a loan was usury. In modern times, that's been redefined to mean excessive interest on a loan, in recognition of the fact that if you earn your money and you save it and you forego the pleasure of it and then lend it to someone else so they can use it for their venture, you are entitled to compensation called interest, reasonable interest. Nobody challenges that today. But what is excessive interest? Thomas Edison said, "People who will not turn a shovelful of dirt on the project nor contribute a pound of materials will collect more money than will the people who will supply all the materials and do all the work." When I read that, I wondered, is that true? So I got my little calculator out and punched in the numbers. You can do this. Take, for example, a $100,000 home. Let's assume that $30,000 goes for land, architect's fees, sales commissions, permits, and all that kind of thing, all the other intangibles. $70,000 goes for labor and materials. These are the people that are going to do the work now and provide the materials. The buyer puts up $30,000 as a down payment and borrows the $70,000. He takes out an 11% loan over 30 years, punch in the numbers, and here's what you get. He will pay in interest $167,806, which is about 2.5 times greater than paid to those who do all the labor and provide all the materials. 2.5 times greater. You may say, well, that represents the time value of money. Remember, somebody saved the money, forwent the privilege of it, and so forth. Not this money. Now, it may be true in a savings and loan association that you would put in some money and then they lend it out to somebody else on their home. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the origin of that money. Before you got it to even put into the savings and loan, somebody had to borrow it, or it wouldn't be in existence. And if you borrowed the money from the bank, then you don't even have to worry about that indirect effect. That money, ladies and gentlemen, came out of nothing. And my question to you is, what is the proper interest rate for nothing? It's zero, isn't it? I would say that any interest on nothing is excessive interest. Now, I'm not just talking about a $100,000 house. You have to multiply this over all of the investments in the world, American investments. You have to apply this to every dollar that exists everywhere in the world. This process is going on, earning daily compounded interest to a member of the banking cartel that created that money out of nothing. That is a huge, unimaginable river of wealth flowing into the hands of the banking cartel. The Federal Reserve System is the supreme instrument of usury. Well, where has this money gone? And what are those people doing with it? Well, ladies and gentlemen, they are not acquiring yachts and mansions. They have enough of those already, long ago. They got tired of them on Jekyll Island. They abandoned those mansions there. That's not the action. After wealth, there is only power. And what they have been doing with that money is that they have been buying up the world. Not so much its real estate or its factories or its hardware, but they've been buying up the power centers of the world. And by that I mean they have been buying up politicians, political parties, TV networks, newspapers and wire services, university, labor unions, any institution which controls people. In other words, they have been acquiring control over you and your children. Whole governments in the world, in the third world, Asia, Africa, South America, whole governments have been bought up through the International Monetary Fund, a process of loaning them money and getting them so dependent upon that money, which is created primarily by the Federal Reserve, that those little tin-horn dictators down there can't imagine surviving any other way. They've been bought, literally, by this money. And they're very happy to be merged into this new world order where they are given a privileged position in the structure. They have their fun and their games. They have control over their people. They have been bought, lock, stock, and barrel. And our own country is well on the way. So the game, I want to say to you, the game here is not wealth, it is power. And so that leads us to the question of what lies ahead for us. I see two possible scenarios. One I call the pessimistic scenario. The other I call the realistic scenario. You notice one of them is missing there, the optimistic scenario. There isn't any. I wish I could tell you that there's an optimistic scenario, but the time is over when I could just say, well, vote Republican or send in a donation. It's not that easy anymore. There's going to be a price to pay, a horrible price to pay, and we are going to have to pay it. But the good news is that we can come out of this if we're willing to make the sacrifices that are necessary. But anyway, getting back to the pessimistic scenario, I'll get to the realistic one in just a moment. The pessimistic scenario is the New World Order. That's what it's called. It's one world government through the United Nations. The Federal Reserve System will become eventually a part of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which will then perform for the whole world the same function that the Fed now performs for the United States and to a large extent for the world too. Not just any kind of world government I'm talking about, but a special kind. This may surprise you, but I have nothing against world government if it's the right kind. If it's the right kind built around the principles of individual freedom and personal responsibility and the right to do as you please and get government off your back and not be forced into a mold, have all your freedoms, be a great concept. But not any kind of world government will do. Adolf Hitler had something in mind. He would love to have established a world government, but we knew instinctively that wasn't the kind we wanted, but nobody's asking questions anymore. The whole issue is, well, do you want world government or don't you? The kind they are building on the East River in New York is not the kind you and I want. It is a totalitarian system. If you look at the member nations there, you realize that we would be submerged into a collective morass our political and economic systems would be brought down to the lowest common denominator of all the nations of the world. And you know, many of them just can hardly wait to get their hands on our beautiful cities and our homes and all of our assets. And they will do it if we give them the military and the economic powers to do it. That process is underway right now. I won't go into more details because, as I said, it's a pessimistic scenario, and it's too pessimistic for a meeting like this. I'll just tell you that we don't want it. And no matter what it takes for us to avoid it is well worth the effort. But what about that realistic scenario? Yes, it can be done if we're willing to pitch in and give it the kind of dedication and effort that it deserves. I mean, we're talking about fighting for our freedoms here. Not just our financial security, but our freedoms as well. I see that there's a possibility of a 16-step program to get our monetary system back to a sound dollar. I won't bore you with those details because some of them are fairly technical, but I will say that we need to pass 3 milestones along the way. One, we have to establish a real dollar based on silver and gold. We have to do that first because we cannot phase out the Federal Reserve notes or the Federal Reserve System, which is step number 2, until we have a real money in place. If we just abolish the Federal Reserve System in one step, you realize what would happen? Our economy would collapse because we would have no money. We have to establish a real money first. It's the kind of predicament we're in. And the third step would be to pay off the national debt, and it can be done. Won't be easy, but it can be done. And the trick is to do it in such a way and in a certain sequence as to not to trigger some kind of a chaotic event, which our totalitarian, would-be totalitarian masters would love to see happen, because then they could use that as an excuse to clamp down all kinds of police state measures on us, and the people might be grateful to have it. No matter what we do, ladies and gentlemen, there is white water ahead. I'm reminded of the history involved here. You know, the Federal Reserve is the 3rd central bank we've had. It came as a surprise to me. The first one was called the Bank of North America, and it was in place before our Constitution was written. It was chartered by the Continental Congress. And it was such a fiasco, they got rid of it real fast. It was terrible. The second one was called the Bank of the United States, and that's the one that President Andrew Jackson went after. Remember, he said we must slay the hydra-headed monster? He was talking about a central bank, which we had. The reason I'm mentioning this is because at that time, when public sentiment was turning against the Bank of the United States, the head of that bank, a fellow by the name of Nicholas Biddle, decided to pull out all the stops. And he deliberately contracted the money supply, which he could do. Central banks can contract it or expand it at their will, to deliberately create an economic crisis and a panic in this country, and he did. And he pointed the finger to Jackson. He said, you see what happens when you start tampering with this wonderful banking system? And Congress called for the impeachment of Jackson. And it was just a miracle that the truth got out. And when it finally was learned that it was Biddle himself that had manipulated the money supply to create the economic crisis, then it was Biddle and his bank that got tossed out on the ear, and Jackson was brought back as a hero. But it was that close. Do you think that the people who run the Federal Reserve System would try something like that today if they thought they were going to lose their grip over this mechanism? Yeah, I think so. That's why I say there's white water ahead. No matter what we do, we have to be prepared for what comes, and we have to know who is doing it and not rush right into the mouth of the creature and say, oh, please save us. So, what can we do? Well, first thing is to prepare economically, I suppose, for ourselves and our families. I'm not going to stand here and pretend to be a financial advisor for you. I have listed in my book 6 very simple, reasonable suggestions for everybody to follow to try and get their own affairs in good shape. Nothing very complicated. You probably know everything that's in there. For example, step number 1 is get out of debt to whatever extent is possible. 6 steps. You should look at those and consider them seriously It could make a difference on how well you weather the storm ahead, or even if you weather the storm ahead. I want to say also that I do not have a plan for you to profit from the coming collapse of America. I mean, I get newsletters or I get offers for newsletters in the mail every week. Say, you know, rampant inflation coming, collapse of the dollar coming, you know, and here's how you can make a killing on all of this. Well, I have no quarrel with people who want to be realistic about what is coming ahead and invest wisely. But I'm not urging anyone to get into a market game where you make a profit from all of this, because, you know, if you were making big bucks on this rampant inflation, I can just imagine how hard it would be at the end of the year. You say, boy, I made $120,000 on inflation this year. Yeah, I sure want inflation to stop. See, you'd be torn. You say, well, maybe not quite so soon. You cannot serve two masters. The best way to avoid being destroyed by inflation is to stop inflation. And the best way to avoid being destroyed in the economic crisis ahead is to either prevent it or to minimize it. And how do you do that? That means you have to save the system of ours. Nobody's going to survive if our system goes down the tubes. And how do you do that? Well, the bad news is that it's boring. My solution is not to pick up your gun and go out and dig a foxhole and get ready for the Armageddon. My solution is to go out and educate your fellow Americans, because you're going to need them at your side. Right now, if a man stood up and ran for Congress and spoke about the things of which I'm speaking, the average voter would look at him and say, what is he talking about? He could not be elected. We have to change that. A grassroots educational program is essential if we expect to get good men elected. Congress is the key. Congress got us into this mess, and it can get us out of the mess. There are 535 people in Washington who pass all the laws. Did you know that? That's our target. 535 big spenders. Well, not all of them are big spenders. We've already got some good ones there. But all we have to do is reach half plus one of that group, which is only 268. Well, it's not even that bad, because if you just take Congress alone, forget the Senate. Congress is the source of all appropriations bills. There are only 435 in Congress, and half plus one of that is 218. It's getting better. And it's really not even that hard, because, ladies and gentlemen, if we were to replace 100 congressmen, the big spenders, do you know what would happen to the rest of those guys there? Because they've all got their finger to the wind to see which way it's going. And that would be one heck of a wind. They'd be walking around saying, well, I've been trying to warn my fellow constituents about this danger for many years. I don't care what they believe. Well, I do care, but I want them to vote the right way. So our goal is 100 congressional seats. Now that is where this trim committee comes in so well. As you leave here, there's a table in the back. I want you to stop by. You'll see the Birch Society material, and particularly the trim material. I should have brought up a bulletin. Could you hand me one of those, please? Oh, you've all got one at your chair. Okay, so I don't have to describe it. Well, for the video. These are little bulletins that the trim committees pass out. TRIM stands for Tax Reform Immediately. And on the back, they have the local congressman, his picture, his name, and his voting record on 8 vital issues that involve expenditures of tax dollars, or in this case, expenditures of inflation tax dollars. And he's given a report card. An X means he voted for bigger government and higher taxes. A star indicates that he voted for less government and lower taxes. And the members of the trim committees are putting these bulletins out all throughout the congressional districts. This has nothing to do with Republicans or Democrats. This is nonpartisan. It's just showing the people how their congressman is voting. And you know, most of them have a lot more X's than they have stars. And the people who are getting these bulletins, they don't have to know about Jekyll Island or the Mandrake mechanism or anything else. They can say, oh, hey, this guy's spending my money. He's a big spender. And most people can understand that they don't want that. These trim bulletins have already been tremendously successful in replacing some of those big spenders in Washington, and the project is just now getting underway. So I urge you to become a member of TRIM. Get these bulletins, pass them out, contribute financially so they can put them inside newspapers, and they hand them out at post offices in all kinds of ways, and they're going out by the tens of thousands. And then beyond the TRIM bulletins, we have to educate our fellow Americans. People such as you who have taken an evening out of your time to come and listen to a lecture like this. It just amazes me when I think about it. But it tells me that you are concerned already. You're concerned and you want to be informed. And I know that people who do that have a great deal of influence over their friends. Every one of you in this room, I'm sure, has a stronger influence than you know over at least 10 and probably 20 or more people who listen to you for advice. They may not understand everything you say. They may think you're a little kooky sometimes in some of the things you say, but generally they listen, and you do have an influence. That's where the Birch Society comes in, with its program of educational forums, its lecture series like this, its video activism. It's a very important operation. You cannot accomplish the goals that we've set for ourselves without a hardcore educational foundation. If you're not familiar with the Birch Society, please do so tonight. Look at the literature, check it out, come to the meetings. If you're serious about changing the complexion of Congress and changing the awareness level of your fellow Americans, the Birch Society is the only game in town. Now I'd like to conclude by giving you some good news. I bet you wonder what it is. The good news, ladies and gentlemen, is that we can overthrow the government of the United States every 2 years without firing a single shot, if we just get out there and do the job. The only problem is that the average American is convinced that the topic of the Federal Reserve System is just too complicated. You see what Epictetus has done to us. He's done that to us. So I think it's time to send him back to Phrygia. It's time to slay the creature from Jekyll Island. And it's time to convert the appearance of the fourth kind into a disappearance of the first kind. Thank you very much.